All right, children, today we're in for a real treat. We are reading Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, which is one of my favorite plays of all time. So this is gonna be fun. Betty, get Johnny out of your mouth. Stop it, you're in 11th grade. Anyway, there were two people, one named Willie, and he was married to a lady by the name of Linda, and together they had two children, one named Happy and one named Biff. They were brothers. Weird names, I know, but that's okay. It's a play. It's not like it matters that much. Together, they all lived on the Starlight Express orbiting the planet of Niptar, and their job was to provide the butt AIDS virus vaccine to all of the indigenous butt people on the planet of Niptar. It was a dirty, thankless job, but they did it anyways, having been inspired by Bono's hit single, Beat It. Now that didn't make any sense at all, did it? No, and that's because I took what was initially an awesome story and totally butchered it by not having any respect for the original material or for my audience as a whole. And if that's weird and doesn't make much sense, that's, I guess, intentional, sort of. Point proven? Regardless, that's my way of segueing into this week's topic, which is, of course, Bethesda and how they happen to ruin the lore of any story that they put their hands on. And if you hear weird sounds in the background, that's because my dog is currently cleaning herself on the floor, and she's kind of noisy, so sorry. Nonsensical intros aside, this video was actually inspired by the recently leaked news that Bethesda might be working on a Game of Thrones spin-off title of some sort. Basically, Skyrim rebranded as a Game of Thrones specific title. And I actually believe this would be a terrible idea because the one thing that makes Game of Thrones stand out is its lore and is the story and the narrative side, and that is the one element of Bethesda games that even Bethesda fanboys say they suck at. Now, don't get me wrong, Bethesda is very good at crafting open world experiences that feed creativity and that offer some of the most immersive single player worlds that have ever been crafted in the realm of video games. It truly is incredible, and they are the best in the business at it, or at least one of the best. But when it comes to narrative and to storytelling, they lag far behind the rest of the herd. Now, I've said this previously, but most people seem to think that I was being overly critical and didn't provide enough sources. So I went online, scoured forums, looked on Steam community pages, and found many interesting discussions from people that know the Fallout universe far better than I, all of which I've linked down below. And I'm going to point out all of these instances that they were able to find where Bethesda has butchered the lore of Fallout. These are going to be varied, but ultimately my goal is simply to show that Bethesda does not exactly handle source material very respectfully. They view it much, much more loosely and as a general guideline than as a strict guide that they are forced to follow. And therefore, if they were to get the license to a Game of Thrones title, I think narratively it would end up being a horrible, horrible disappointment. But with all that said, let's get into our first example. Now, all of this is going to be based off of Fallout 4, because after all, Bethesda has only made two Fallout titles, Fallout 3 and Fallout 4. Fallout New Vegas having been developed by Obsidian Entertainment as its own independent spin-off title, which actually handled the lore of Fallout much more respectfully than Fallout 3 or than Fallout 4. But the reason we're focusing on Fallout 4 specifically as opposed to Fallout 3 is because the longer a studio has access and has the rights to a title, the more opportunities they have to really mess it up. And Fallout 3 was their first outing. They were going off of lore that was pretty well established, and they messed some stuff up, but Fallout 4 was their first venture into a previously quite unknown realm of the Fallout universe, and so it was their opportunity to shine or to collapse, and as we'll see, they didn't exactly do well. At this point, I will also say that there are going to be massive spoilers for Fallout 4 and for the majority of the Fallout franchise, so if you are adverse to those, you should probably click away right now before we get into it. But with that said, our first example hinges on the Institute, the one organization that seems to be controlling most of the Commonwealth, or at least have such overwhelming influence that they have managed to petrify everyone who lives within it. Now, there's a lot of issues, narratively speaking, with the Institute. We can talk about their goals as we will, and we can also talk about how it ultimately concludes. The Institute can fall at the end of Fallout 4 to the Minutemen, to the Brotherhood, or to the Railroad, depending on who you choose to side with. But either way, they end up losing to these seemingly small and, in comparison, rather weak factions. Now, to just be simple and straightforward, Generation 3 synths were available for 58 years leading up to the events of Fallout 4. And if that's possible, and if that's true, then let's just assume that they're able to produce 15 to 20 synths per day, considering their power restrictions and all manner of issues that they could potentially run into. Now, if that's true, the Institute would be able to produce roughly 423,400 Generation 3 synths over the course of that 58-year period. Now, that is such a huge number of independent soldiers who are more powerful than your average human, who are able to do much, much more, who can withstand radiation, who aren't prone to being attacked by predators because they're made of metal and there would be nothing to actually prey on. This would be the ultimate army of almost 500,000, and that's considering that they're only making 20 of these individual synths per day. But even if you were to go about and say that for whatever reason they had to cut their production by 25%, you would still be producing 317,550 synths, which is far, far more than the Railroad, than the Brotherhood, or than the Minutemen would ever be able to handle. In fact, that's such a huge number of synths that in reality, there's nothing stopping the Institute from being able to go through and subjugate every single individual on the entirety of the North American continent. With this massive of an army, the Institute would easily be able to go over to New Vegas with simply 10,000 of these synths and completely subjugate or take over the entirety of the New Vegas Strip, taking out Caesar's Legion and practically anybody who would stand in their way. An army this size could also easily take out the NCR. And of course, as we previously said, this is considering that they didn't produce on 25% of occasions and they were only making 20 of these synths per day, even though they had access to this technology 58 years prior, and it's only fair to assume that their manufacturing capability would go up as time progressed and as they were able to widen their infrastructure. Now, even if all of this isn't true, and they didn't have access to the Gen 3 synths for 58 years prior to the events of Fallout 4, even if for whatever reason maybe there was a resource scarcity and they weren't able to actually produce that many synths, only 20 per day, but even if they weren't able to produce that many synths, even though there's nothing in the game that strictly prohibits this from happening or says that they wouldn't be capable of producing that many per day consistently, even if that were the case, the Institute still doesn't make much sense on many different accounts. For instance, the entire goal of the Institute, what's their purpose? What are they trying to achieve? Something pretty simple and straightforward to figure out in a narrative sense is the motivation for whatever your bad guy, your antagonist or antagonists are. However, in Fallout 4, it's not really clear what the purpose is. Are they trying to build a better future for humanity underground where it's peaceful, where they don't have to deal with the radiation of the upper level ground, and from the outside where they don't have to worry about super mutants or rad roaches or whatever coming after them? Is that what they're going for? Well, that doesn't quite make sense. If they really were a peaceful group simply trying to provide a home for the humans that they have within their walls, and they were trying to widen humanity's scope while focusing on themselves and the underground world and making that stronger, then there would be no reason for them to send out coursers every time a synth chooses to go rogue, and as a result, killing tons of people in the process, murdering them to the point where it's open for discussion as to whether or not the Institute is actively trying to replace and kill people. If they were really keeping to themselves, people in Diamond City wouldn't be casually chatting about how their neighbor was just shot because they were a synth. If they are a peaceful, very secluded group, then they're very bad at being peaceful and secluded. Sean even says a few different times that the Institute is trying to help humanity with synths, that it's a sort of natural evolution, and synths are the next step. And if that's true, fine. But even Sean seems conflicted throughout the course of his dialogue as to what actually is going on with the synths. Occasionally, he says that they feel emotions, and at the end of the game, he provides you a Sean, a young Sean that is a synth, but he asks you to treat him as your actual child and to act as though he's an actual person. Even though Sean just previously stated in a conversation about half an hour earlier that synths are just soulless machines who are completely incapable of exercising free will, despite the fact, of course, that they're able to choose to escape the Institute. Just look at Valentine. Furthermore, speaking of Sean, it's implied at least that he dies of cancer near the end of the game. All of a sudden, you're talking with him, and then he's laying in a bed about to kick it, and this isn't exactly explained very well. And the reason this doesn't make a whole lot of sense is because both in Fallout 1 and in New Vegas, it's already established that cancer isn't a problem, especially for the Institute. Now, a Steam user by the name of Mithra P, who I've been referencing throughout the video and who I will continue to reference because he's absolutely brilliant in breaking this down, put this all very, very well and succinctly to the point where I don't think I'm going to be able to summarize it better. So this is going to be a direct quote from one of his posts, which I've also included in the description box below. Quote, in Fallout 4, we learned that super mutants are immune to cancer thanks to their regenerative cells. It is actually a very important point in the Fallout universe, since it's one of the reasons why the Master actually considers his army worthy of conquering the world, despite the intelligence issue that a lot of them are faced with. Now, bear in mind, that was over a century before Fallout 4. Now, the Institute grows its own super mutants, as we see in Fallout 4, which means that, just like Richard Moreau before them, they hold, quote-unquote, the vaccine to cancer within their labs. Furthermore, remember that Mr. House was also an Institute student, not its president like Sean, but rather a regular student. And before he turned 30, 2 centuries before Fallout 4, he had already unlocked the secret to immortality, as we see in Fallout New Vegas. Now, Mr. House was able to maintain this immortality simply with a little army of robots and some money and some manipulation of local tribes. That's all he needed. But Sean, your son Sean, is the head of the freaking Institute, the Institute that gave Mr. House the key to immortality and also the key to cancer cures as well. There is no reason why he should just all of a sudden be sick laying in a bed. If anything, they could hook him up to some sort of pipe and iron lung and he'd be fine. It would be great and he'd be able to live forever just like Mr. House. But I know what you're thinking. Perhaps he has some weird sickness where that can't happen, or maybe Mr. House had some special genetic thing that made him able to use that technology and Sean wasn't able to. But regardless, it isn't stated in the game and it isn't expressed or explained. All it says is that Sean all of a sudden gets sick with what we see as cancer, and that simply doesn't make sense. Continuing on with the Institute, the Brotherhood of Steel has the option to blow up the Institute if you choose to side with them as your faction at the end of the game. But this doesn't make much sense at all, especially once you know anything about the Brotherhood of Steel. Now, the important thing to remember is that the Brotherhood of Steel essentially is sworn to protect and to worship technology. That's what they're looking for. That's what they're trying to preserve. And if you have any semblance of understanding of Fallout's lore, this becomes immensely clear very, very quickly. But the issue in Fallout 4 is just what I said earlier. the Brotherhood of Steel chooses to nuke it as opposed to going in there and scavenging whatever they can. It's completely uncharacteristic of the Brotherhood of Steel. In fact, it flies in the way of everything that they swear they are for in this world. Once again, it's possible that Bethesda had some sort of explanation for this. Perhaps the head of the Brotherhood of Steel that you interact with, perhaps he's a little corrupt, or maybe he isn't fully on board, but whatever their excuse is, if they have one, it's not communicated to the player. And time again, we come across these issues where there's something very clearly wrong with the lore, with the narrative of the story they're trying to tell, but they don't explain it away. And then afterwards they say that there's a reason for it, or it has reason in the lore, but it wasn't clear enough or something, or it's told too subtly for the able-minded gamer to be able to understand. But the reality is that if they don't tell you, and if it's not in the world that they give you, it's practically non-existent. Now, there's also many common sense based criticisms that you can make of the narrative with regards to Fallout 4. One that struck me on my first playthrough of Fallout 4 was simply the glowing sea and Virgil hiding out in it. Now, Virgil is a super mutant, at least he's been turned into one, which is why it doesn't bother him to hang out in this highly irradiated area. However, who is he hiding from? Well, he's hiding from the Institute. However, the Institute's soldier base is entirely made up of synths who are also immune to radiation. So it doesn't make any sense for him to be hiding out in the glowing sea if the only thing that's protecting him within the glowing sea is the radiation. Now, you could also say that there's a bunch of giant irradiated monsters and death claws surrounding him and surrounding the glowing sea, which would make it difficult. But most of these creatures kill because they're looking for something to eat, which is why they come after you, the player character. They would have no reason to attack a metallic object such as a synth. Perhaps if they looked very human-like, they would attack them, but the Institute also has synths that look very, very inhuman, and you actually fight against them many times throughout the game as well. All of this ignoring the fact that the Institute contains technology that allows them to teleport their soldiers and their synths to individual areas with pretty accurate results. And so hiding in the glowing sea really just in general and overall doesn't make any sense at all. Now, because common sense would dictate that Virgil has no place in the Commonwealth, especially in the glowing sea, he should flee as far away from the Institute as humanly, or rather super mutantly possible, perhaps fleeing to New Vegas or someplace like that. And that actually could have been a really cool moment in the game when perhaps you had to teleport to this area where Virgil was hiding. He gives you some coordinates, or you get access to some coordinates, you plug them in, then you get teleported to Virgil within Gomorrah or perhaps the King's hideout or something like that, or a big casino, but on next-gen hardware, to just give a little tip of the hat to New Vegas and what they did for the series. But no. Instead, Bethesda says, well, that sounds like a lot of work, so we're just going to throw him in a cave in a glowing sea that's highly irradiated and surrounded by monsters that aren't going to attack or damage his enemies and the people he's actually hiding from. A quick little rebuttal that just struck me and I wanted to throw out there so you can take it or leave it is the fact that some of the newer synths, it's implied at least, that they do take radiation damage because they're getting to the point where they're so human-like that they're taking similar types of damage. However, Generation 1 and 2 synths are purely robotic and don't take any radiation damage, so even that doesn't make sense. Perhaps Virgil thinks that the Institute doesn't have access to Gen 1 or 2 synths, but even that is a massive stretch and would call into doubt all of the help that he gives you if he's so stupid that he isn't aware that they have access to old synths. The last two examples that I'll point to were probably the most atrocious and truly frustrating when I played through Fallout 4 and the subsequent DLC, and it was truly baffling when I came across them. The first one I'm sure you are all aware of, and that is, simply put, Mama Murphy. Fallout 4 and the Fallout universe apparently now has psychics who are fueled by drugs, because why not? Honestly, I've sat here for 2 years trying to figure out why Bethesda felt that it was necessary to have a psychic character. Seriously, somebody sat down at a table writing session with all the writers sitting around the table, and they talked to each other and they were throwing out ideas, and then somebody said, what if we had this old lady who takes drugs and then has psychic visions? Wouldn't that be cool? And then they all agreed and said, yeah, let's put that in the game. That actually happened. That alone should tell you how incompetent the writing staff at Bethesda Game Studios is. And if they want any chance of being taken seriously as a narrative storytelling game studio, which I don't believe they do, but if they would want that, they have to fire everyone that sat at that table. Further proving my point, Nuka World introduces the concept of magic into the series. Oswald, the magician mini-boss that you fight, literally can teleport and has magic and crap, and there's no explanation. It's not like he had some Institute technology that he was using to make it look like he had magic. No, he just straight up had magic. There's magic and supernatural forces within the Fallout universe now. They're probably trying to set it up for some crossover between Elder Scrolls and Fallout, some massive MMO where it's all tied together. It's going to be terrible. They simply don't respect the worlds that they have gotten access to, and I think Oswald and Mama Murphy are probably the chief examples of it. Actually, come to think of it, I probably could have saved you about 20 minutes and just said Mama Murphy and Oswald at the beginning of the video and just proven my point that way, but I've already done all this work, and so I'm just going to keep it and leave this as the period to this sentence. Now, I could keep going. I could talk about the fact that caps don't make sense as a monetary unit within the Commonwealth, just geographically speaking. I could point to the fact that Bethesda seems focused on making sure that super mutants are always portrayed as big, dumb creatures that are just focused on killing people, when in previous Fallout 1, Fallout 2, and even New Vegas, super mutants are shown to even have a side that's incredibly intelligent and sophisticated and different, and they can actually focus on building a society, and they can have a higher goal as opposed to just killing people. And I could point to all these things, we could talk about them all day long, but when it comes down to it, many people simply don't care. It doesn't matter, and that's okay. You know, if you're playing Skyrim and you're just having a good time, it probably doesn't matter if a particular arrangement of the architecture isn't correct, or if there's a statue of some Nordic creature here in this gothic or goblin whatever. It doesn't really matter to you. You're having a good time with the game. But it does show a consistent lack of respect for the lore and for the story and for the narrative, the characters, and even common sense to do all of this and to consistently do all of this. And there's even tweets from Pete Hines, the PR of marketing and PR at Bethesda, going through and saying that it doesn't matter. Realism doesn't matter. The lore doesn't really matter to them. They're focused on trying to give their developers the freedom to have a good time while making quests. So be it. But if we're talking about narrative, if we're talking about trying to tell a cohesive story, you can't have that cavalier of an attitude towards it, and you have to approach it with more respect and obsession, and this compulsive obsession for attention to detail. And that's why people loved The Witcher 3. That's why people love The Last of Us, because they focus all the way throughout on trying to make sure that the world is consistent and steady and firm, and isn't just filled with all sorts of little instances where you have to check out in order for it to make sense. You aren't going to find a kid that was locked in a fridge for 200 years in The Last of Us, or somebody that just happens to go around and locks themselves in a crate for 200 years in frickin' The Witcher 3. You're not going to run into that because they take it a little more seriously. And if Bethesda is focused on having just a goofier, more fun time with their games, fine, so be it. I have no problem with that. I'm going to still enjoy their games. But when people say that they are going to get rights to a very narrative-heavy franchise such as Game of Thrones or any other franchise or IP, I think you should think twice before getting on board with that. But that's all I really have to say this week. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, like it, leave a comment down below. I've been here making this video with a dog that smells truly horrible. She's laying on the ground right there, kicked up. She kind of looks dead when she's sleeping, but don't we all? My gosh, you smell so terrible. I gotta open a window. Thank you for watching. I love you all. I'll see you next video. My goodness. Stinky dog. How you doing? Comfy? That's where I've been sitting to make the video, and that's where she's laying.